Streaming my team. I'm asking my team.
Yep, that's about to start. It's just loading right now. So, all right. Yes, we're streaming.
Okay. Hello, everybody. Welcome to our one in a series of our virtual forums that we're holding here. I'm Kimberly Graham. I'm a candidate for United States Senate here in the state of Iowa. And we are holding this series of virtual forums because we can no longer, of course, go around and shake people's hands and have in-person conversations. So this is the next best thing. And tonight I'm very excited to have this Black Lives Matter forum that we are putting on, and I'm extremely honored to have a couple of very important guests. My co-host, who is Lynn County Supervisor Stacy Walker. Thank you for being here, Stacy. And we have Mr. Bernard Clayton, who is the Iowa Democratic Party Black Caucus Vice Chair. And rather than me kind of introduce each of you and maybe get it wrong, if each of you could just say a couple of words about, who you are and what you do, and then we'll dive into discussion. Stacy.
So let me start by thanking you for hosting this, Kimberly. It's I said on social media earlier, it's almost become standard operating procedure, at least here in Iowa, for elected officials and activists of color to speak about these issues. And it's really refreshing to have a candidate for high office who is not a person of color take it upon themselves to initiate these very important conversations. So thank you. My name is Stacy Walker. I have the honor and privilege of serving on the Lynn County Board of Supervisors. And I've been deeply active in social justice movements and liberation causes for my entire life. And it's an honor to be asked to join this conversation to talk about some very important issues that not too many people in Iowa politics actually talk about. So it's an honor and a privilege to be here. Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Stacy. Mr. Clayton. Tell us a little bit about yourself for those that might be watching who don't know who you are. They should, but.
Hey, thank you. And I appreciate you inviting me to discuss this very important topic. I'm a native of St. Louis, Missouri, and I am the vice chair of the Iowa Democratic Black Caucus. I served in that role from 2012 to 2015, and I'm back in that role on an interim basis. Now, I would like to say, before we go any further, is that the Black Caucus does not endorse candidates during a primary, but we do participate and we are active in the political conversation to keep it going. And I'm a former president of the Cedar Rapids branch of the NAACP, and I've been engaged in the process for a long time. And I guess I'm not going to say. Well, I would like to suggest some books that people might read, because I know we got a limited amount of time, and I'm gonna try to, when I talk, I'm trying to be concise. I would suggest people, if you want to take a note of this, there's a documentary called 13. That would be a good the documentary to watch. The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander. That'd be another good book to read that will help you understand how we got where we're at. And Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome by Dr. Joy DeGruy. And the next book, I forget the author, but it's a very good book. It's Racism Without Racist. And that book discusses how we continue to do racist things, but they do not have the appearance of being racist. That's kind of the gist of the book. So just give you that information. So if you want to dig a lot deeper into the conversation that we're going to have tonight, those are some places that you can go. I appreciate your time. And again, I appreciate you inviting me, ma'am.
Oh, well, thank you. I really appreciate you being here. And just so everybody knows, Khadijah, who's from my team, has put 13th, the New Jim Crow, Racism Without Racist, and Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome. Was that the other one, Mr. Clayton?
Yes.
Yeah, post-traumatic slave syndrome is the other book, Khadija. So those are all books and a film that people that want to really learn more can dive into. And and I want to say that as a white woman in this country, I have so much to learn, and I think we need to get to where we need to get to where in this country where we white people can say we have a lot to learn. And unfortunately, some people don't even think that's true. And to say and it is the opinion of too many people still in this country that slavery happened hundreds of years ago, that was in the past. They don't know the history. They don't know what happened after that. They don't know, a lot of white Americans don't know about Jim Crow. They don't know about the black codes. They don't know about the sundown towns. They don't know about any of that. And so I've been making more of an effort to educate myself, so that I can try to, when you know better, you do better, and when you know more, hopefully you do better. And so that I can be not just an ally, we hear people talk about being an ally, but be an accomplice. I can be more than that. I can actually see enough and know enough that I can be more helpful, and really listen. So I'm here to listen. I think the job of the United States Senator is to, above everything, listen, and listen some more, and find out what your constituency, what your people need to live lives of health and dignity. And then you go to DC and you advocate for those policies and those laws that will help those people live lives of health and dignity. And you amplify the voices of the people that need their voices amplified. If you're lucky enough to be in a position of power where you have the microphone, hopefully you pass that microphone over when it's handed to you. So with that, I'd like to just kind of, basically kind of turn it over to Stacy and to Mr. Clayton to kind of drive the conversation. Stacy and I talked a little bit last night about a couple of potential topics, but I really want this to be a conversation, and people can type their questions in. If they have comments or questions, they can type them into the QA section here on our platform, so that we can have a discussion here, for the next little more than an hour. And recognizing that an hour is, that's not even scratching the surface at all about this topic, but we do want to put a spotlight on it, and then encourage people to watch the 13th and read those books and learn more. So, one of the things Stacey and I talked about was the COVID-19 pandemic, and how we are already seeing the truth of that kind of old adage, when America gets a cold, Black Americans get pneumonia. I'm probably paraphrasing badly, but, and just the reality that any crisis hits minority communities so much harder, than others. So you want to go ahead and talk about that. And Stacy, by the way, if there's anybody listening who is not aware, Stacy is the Lynn County supervisor, and Lynn County is one of the spots in Iowa where COVID-19 is spreading the most quickly.
That's correct. Thank you for that. Yes, Lynn County is indeed a hot spot here. Our region has been assigned the score of 10 by Governor Reynolds, which I guess that means it's pretty bad. But we are doing everything we can to mitigate this very serious virus, and working with all of our partners in government and throughout the community to do what we can to keep our people safe, in lieu of stronger leadership from the state and federal level. So hopefully, Kimberly, you will be successful in this election and be a voice for the people who need you. But to speak more directly to the point you brought up about disparities in communities of color, this is something that is as old as the country. As long as there's been an America, there have been individuals in this country who always get the short end of the stick, and it's through no fault of their own, but it's through what we call structural and institutional racism. It's why, there's disproportionate outcomes in people who have asthma, and disproportionate outcomes in people who have, high blood pressure and hypertension and all of those things. It's about how this society has been organized to keep communities of color in compromising positions. You also said in your introduction, and this all sort of plays together nicely. You talked about how, I think a lot of people in this country understand the traumas, the trials and tribulations of people of color to have begun with slavery and ended with slavery. But the troubles of people of color in this country did not end in the mid-1800s. There was a period of Reconstruction, of Jim Crow, of the civil rights movement, that has only continued. And again, my thanks to Bernard Clayton, who outlined a few different resources. 13th is great. The New Jim Crow is excellent. They give you a much more detailed history of why these things are happening. But the topic today is Black Lives Matter. And I think a lot of people have heard the slogan Black Lives Matter. And I think it means a lot of different things to a lot of folks. And we need to straight away dispel the idea that Black Lives Matter somehow discounts the value of other lives. And instead, it is shining a light on the injustices and the harms done to African Americans and people of color by institutions, by systems, and quite honestly, by people, many of whom don't even realize they're visiting a harm on the lives of people of color in this country. But, I think people think of Black Lives Matter as having started officially 2011, 2012, where we had, Trayvon Martin being killed in Florida. You had Michael Brown in Ferguson. You had Eric Garner in New York, and a whole host of individuals whose cases did not rise to the notoriety of those folks. But the idea of Black liberation started, in at least Black liberation in America, started when Black folks got to America. There has always been a struggle for freedom. There's always been a struggle for the very idea of what it means to be a person, for personhood and for the franchise. I think Black Lives Matter, in my view, is another and much needed iteration of the overall Black liberation movement, not only here in America, but across the globe. And the Black Lives Matter in this iteration, in this form, this iteration of the Black liberation movement began with shining a light on police brutality and the extrajudicial killings of people of color in this country. That has been happening for many, many years. This is not a new thing. And it has evolved into a much broader liberation movement that talks about disparities in health outcomes. It talks about disparities in wealth, that talks about disparities in, the achievement gap, and all of these other issues that we know if we can address meaningfully, it'll make for a better society. So I wanted to sort of start with those opening remarks, and then I guess turn it over or kick it back to you, Kimberly, or ask Mr. Bernard Clayton for his feedback.
Yeah,
Are you ready?
Mr. Clayton, go ahead.
Just to add to that, is one thing that I got a chance to meet Miss Colors or one of the ladies who coined the phrase Black Lives Matter. But before we want to go any further, I want to get something that gets mixed up. They try to put police shootings of Black people and Black people shooting each other. They try to conflict those together. Those are two different things. And I can't tell people how to think, but if you want to think clearly on these issues, you have to see quote unquote Black on Black violence and and police violence against Black people is two separate issues. And I hope that you will do that. And speaking about Michael Brown, I'm from St. Louis, and I was doing some reading about Mrs. Dred Scott. The Dred Scott case was in St. Louis, Missouri, and that was a man who was trying to get free from his slave master. And you can but you can Google that and check it out. But for the sake of time, there was an incident that happened in the 1850s on the wharves of St. Louis. A stevedore did something that a white person didn't like, and they chased him up to the corner of Seventh and Pine, and they killed him and tied him to a tree and burned him and that tree became a tourist attraction. On the corner that he was killed on was the county jail at that time, and catty corner to that is where the old courthouse sits now. Now, going to Michael Brown's case, Michael Brown died simply because he had a comment that a white person didn't like. And that's the main reason why Michael Brown is dead, because he died because he spoke up for himself. Now, we can get into, well, he should have did it or not. And I had a coworker once, and it's always good to listen to people whether you agree with them or not. He made a statement, all that Black people need to do, and I'm paraphrasing, is just listen to what the police say and do what they say. And I thought about it, and I thanked him for it because he gave me an insight into why some of these things were going on. And the one thing that I see it this way: when Black people were freed from slavery, instead of being the property of individual white people, we became the collective property of all white people. And I base that on how we've been treated over the years. And at this point in time in our history, African Americans are still trying to make the transition from being property to being citizens. We're not truly full citizens of this country. And if we could just get that one thing done, become a full citizen of the country, perhaps our treatment would change. And like Stacey Walker, I'm proud of him. He's an elected county supervisor, but even with that position, he's not a full citizen of this country. And that's just in my opinion.
Well, and Kimberly, feel free to jump in at any time here, because I really like this exchange, and I appreciate Bernard's comments. And what I take from that, when we talk about full citizenship or being fully realized as a person, is kind of how I put it. It doesn't matter what office I hold. It doesn't matter what title I may retain. In the eyes of America, first and foremost, I am a Black person. And that's, quite honestly, how I identify. First and foremost, I identify as a Black person. And I know that identity is a complicated thing, but the reason I do that, and I don't want to speak on behalf of all Black people, but I think the reason a lot of Black folks I know are thinking is oriented in this way is because I know that if I am in a neighborhood, a well-to-do neighborhood, and I'm visiting a friend, I know that people are looking at me a certain way. I know that even when I'm in a suit and tie, and I am around folks who don't know me, I know that assumptions are being made about me because of my skin color. My skin color is one of the things about my identity that is fixed, that I do not control, and that brings along with it a lot of, what would be the opposite of privilege? That brings along a lot of issues that we have to deal with. And by the way, these issues are not the exclusive domain of African Americans or Black people. There are a lot of folks in this country, whether they have Black or brown skin or originate from a part of the world that is foreign to the Western world, folks who speak a different language, folks who are undocumented. There are a lot of individuals that suffer simply because of points about their identity, points about their origin, points about their skin color. And a friend of mine put it to me this way. the history of the world has always been about darker skinned people advocating to be fully realized as a person and advocating for full equality. And it almost seems like the darker you are, the harder it is to get by in this life, virtually anywhere in the world. So there is politics of skin color, there's politics of human origin, and there's certainly politics of identity. And all of these things seem to come together and to define the Black experience in America, and has defined the Black experience in America in a harmful way, which is why we need movements like Black Lives Matter, and by extension, which is why we need allies and accomplices, folks like you, Kimberly Graham, who are running for office and are putting all of these issues front and center that, to be quite honest, a lot of politicians in Iowa don't have the courage to do. And that's been really disheartening to me, coming of age in this state, putting a lot of belief in politicians only to be disappointed, that politicians won't even utter the phrase Black Lives Matter, let alone do a deep dive into the issues impacting our communities, so that they can be effective advocates at whatever level. And we certainly could use a lot more of this kind of advocacy in our federal politics here in Iowa.
Yeah, I was given the book. I just hadn't heard of it before, unfortunately, but I was given the book Just Mercy for Christmas by my father-in-law, written by Brian Stevenson, who is the head of the Equal Justice Initiative. And especially as an attorney, because he's an attorney as well, and he does a lot of work with children, especially minority children. And he tells the story in that book about how the sheriff and the judge came in laughing, and he was in the courtroom early in a suit. Like when you said you're in a suit, Stacy, that reminded me of this scene in the book. True story for those of you who are watching this who don't know. Just Mercy is a true story.
Kimberly, did you mention?
He was asked to leave the courtroom.
That was.
Yeah, Mr. Stevenson was asked to leave the courtroom by the judge and the sheriff because he was standing in there before the proceedings started, and he was in a suit, Black man, and they said, "Oh, go wait in the hall for your lawyer." He was the lawyer. Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly. Right.
Did you mention that was in Iowa where that happened?
No, he didn't say that. That was, oh my God.
Yeah, that happened in Iowa. He was representing someone here in Iowa and it was the prosecutor, I believe, and the judge that were in the courtroom, and they were kind of laughing it up and asked him to step outside the courtroom and wait for his attorney. And he goes on after that passage. I'm really glad you brought it up. He said, I could have been really angry at that moment and really let the judge have it and let the prosecutor have it. But I knew if I reacted the way most human beings would react to that sort of blatant disregard and disrespect, that it would harm his client and it might harm him professionally. So he kind of talked about this, switching this gear in his head, which so many people of color have to do in this country. And I have done for a very long time in my life. And I feel like in many ways I'm coming out of my shell, and I've been liberated to speak my mind in a way that I wouldn't have done a year and a half ago. But that is the experience. I mean, it's so many microaggressions that minority groups in this country face. And there are a lot of minority groups. There are gender minority groups. There are minority groups who are defined by their sexuality and sexual identity that put up with these microaggressions that hurt every time, but the sum total of these microaggressions can be devastating. And, minority groups have to decide in their mind how they're going to react. And they're balancing a lot of consequences that I don't think a lot of other folks have to balance. And I'll give you one last quick example before I turn it over back for feedback. There was a politician who I saw today who was irate and he had every right to be irate about what's going on in this state at large meatpacking plants, yelling into the microphone, really letting some folks have it, and they deserved it. And I turned to one of my colleagues, I was watching this press conference, and I said, he's absolutely right, but I could never do that. I could never, ever, ever do that, get in front of a microphone and yell and berate other politicians, because it would, I would be an angry black man, and it would lessen my credibility, and it would turn people off. But white politicians have that privilege. They can be upset. They can use profanity. White politicians have the privilege of being, whimsical and being able to tweet about things that are funny and not so serious. But, if I start to go down that path, I get people asking me why I'm not so serious, and if I am very serious all the time, I have people wondering why can't you lighten up? You're all doom and gloom. And so
you can't win.
Kimberly,
Basically, you can't win.
You can't win. And I'm sure you can relate, Kimberly, in a lot of ways.
A little bit. I'm not at all trying, not at all saying same, but I do relate to, it's, if I'm too worked up, then I'm an emotional woman. If I'm, not worked up enough, then I don't have any emotion. I've had people say, why don't you color your hair? Why don't you, you feel like, okay, fine. I guess there's no way I can win. Yeah. And it's also worth pointing out the fact that Brian Stevenson's story happened, that incident happened in Iowa, just by the by. For anyone watching, maybe everybody watching already knows this. I know that Mr. Clayton and Stacy do. Iowa has some of the very worst disparities as far as our criminal justice system. Here in Iowa, we're at the very bottom of the barrel of the 50 states in our racial disparity issues here. And that circles back to a lot of different things. One of them is prosecutors. The prosecutors have a lot of discretion in charging and sentencing and that kind of thing. And that's, like, as they say, a whole other show. but that is a really significant issue here in Iowa. And and it's one that I almost never hear white politicians, especially in Iowa, even mentioning, and I don't think we can call ourselves allies or accomplices if we don't take our privilege as white people and bring these issues to the forefront. Somebody just commented that whoever it is, Limitless RN, I don't know who that, I don't know the actual name of that person, but just commented that they talk about it. Good, we should all be talking about it. Oh, that's Shelley. Awesome, Shelley. Thanks. We have some.
I knew that was Shelley.
That's Shelley from audio.
I know the young lady.
Hey, Shelley.
I knew it.
I'm going to. We've got a few questions here, just a few. So let's go through these questions. We have Jasmine, either Devora or Deborah. I don't know. She's a former field organizer for Bernie in 2020. Says, we're speaking about racial disparities during the COVID-19 pandemic. And she asks me or Stacy if there's any educational organizing the public can take alongside with us.
Is there any educational organizing?
Mm-hmm.
I'm not
sure.
That we can, I'm not sure what that means.
Jasmine, can you say more and we'll circle back? Can you type more and we'll circle back to?
I think I would comment on. I think I'd comment on that.
Yeah.
What's going on now just bears out what goes on every day in this country. The crisis just brings it to the surface, but all this stuff goes on all the time. And what we really have to, and I don't know if we need to study it or not. I mean, we need facts, but I think we need to be trying to move toward a more just society where we don't have these problems in the first place. I mean, we have to talk about our educational system. We have to talk about healthcare, and also and really the thing we have to talk about is white supremacy. All these institutions are built on white supremacy. They are intertwined, they're intertwined them so close that no one would notice. And when I talk about these things, I don't try to talk about these things in terms of trying to make anybody white feel guilty. That's not a good community relation tool, but we kind of have to talk, we all got to talk about these things. And really the system is not broken. The system works exactly how it's supposed to work. It's working.
That's right.
We have to work towards changing the system and taking it off the agenda that it's on.
Yeah, I agree. You mentioned schools, Mr. Clayton, and I that's something that I talk a lot about. I believe we can no longer fund our public schools through just local property taxes, because then, of course, what happens is if you live in a high property value area, you get the schools with orchestra and band and, that are in good shape, and you get better paid teachers and on and on and on. And when you get this, if you go to the school in the lower property value area, you don't get all that stuff. And you get schools that are the ceilings falling in on you and they can't pay the teachers as much. And you don't have band and orchestra and theater and dance and all these places where a lot of kids find their sense of community. So education in the United States should be an equalizer of opportunity. And it's basically, in my opinion, become a way to keep the opportunity unequal. Because we're starting out with an unequal school, with unequal schools and unequal funding for those schools. So whether that's going to take, shoring up the schools in the lower property tax areas with federal funds, then that's what it takes. But we can't continue to allow, there's schools. There's a school I read about in Missouri a couple of years ago that lost its accreditation. It was so bad. And one of the NPR, National Public Radio reporters, followed this young man of color, this young Black man, around all day to his classes to see exactly what was going on. First of all, the school was so non-secure that she walked around with this kid all day and nobody stopped her. And second of all, this kid was in AP classes, smart kid. He was in advanced placement classes, but he went to his AP class and there was no teacher there. So some other teacher handed him a worksheet and told him to go fill it out in the corner. Like, there was just no quality of education there for this kid. And that is not an unusual story. And we have some of the best schools in the world in this country and some of the schools that fail kids the most in this country. And we have to make a much more concerted effort at not having that be the case.
I want to throw something in on the schools. I'll be real brief. What really needs to happen for schools, public education needs to become a right. A well-funded quality education needs to become a right, and eventually, for us in state constitutions, it should actually be enshrined in the state constitution. Because the reason why we do education, the reason why we're able to do education the way we do in this country, because it's not a right. And it needs to be a right. And by the way, the school that Michael Brown graduated from, that his mom was so proud of him graduating, and I'm not saying she shouldn't have, was an unaccredited high school.
Right.
Well, yeah. I mean, we certainly have compulsory education here up to a certain age. But I do think I agree, Kimberly, that education is supposed to be the great equalizer. And it can only be the great equalizer if we make ample investments to try to balance the scale of inequities that already exist. And I totally agree. We need to rethink how we fund our public schools in this country, because you get the exact kind of outcome that you so wonderfully articulated earlier about wealthy neighborhoods have better schools than poor neighborhoods. And since this country is built on structural and institutional racism, Black and brown people tend to be disproportionately represented in low SES statuses, or for lack of a better term, they're poor. They're overrepresented in the working poor. So they go to schools that aren't adequately funded and taught by teachers who aren't adequately paid and don't develop the sort of hope and aspirations in a lot of cases that other folks develop when they're constantly told, you are great, you are good, you can do well, college is a must, you're going to go here, it will be funded. There's a really interesting study out there, and I'm moving on to higher education because I obviously believe and support universal education. There's a really interesting report out there that shows when you pay for students to take their ACT and SAT, and even mandate it, it puts them on the radars of colleges and universities around the country. And these colleges and universities then start reaching out to these students. So you have students who might have never thought that any sort of schooling after high school was possible, being actively sought by schools who are telling them they're smart, who are telling them we can put together financial packages, or telling them you have an aptitude in this area, let us help you. And they see the amount of people who graduate and apply increase. And when you have barriers like the cost of an ACT or SAT exam, or barriers where people can't access courses or classes to prepare them to take these tests, or barriers that prevent counselors to be in schools to work with students to help them develop a vision for the future, you are sowing the seeds for an inequality that can and has persisted throughout the generations. So education is a big piece of this puzzle.
Yeah, absolutely, 100%. Jason, who is, by the way, our art director of our campaign, has a question. He said, Supervisor Walker, can you talk about, and I hope I'm pronouncing this right, Jareem Mitchell, and how
Jeremy.
maybe there's a, maybe
Jeremy Mitchell.
Oh,
Jeremy. Okay, maybe there was a typo. It looks like it's
Jeremy
maybe
Mitchell.
there's a typo. Anyway,
Jeremy
and
Mitchell.
how he impacted your involvement in public service. He was an acquaintance of Jason's, of our art directors, in the mid-90s, and he was saddened and shocked when he was paralyzed by police.
You want me to get real with you on this Zoom?
Of course, always. So anyone that knows me knows I don't BS people and I don't sugarcoat things. And I'm gonna keep talking. I'm gonna put my blinds down so I'm not in the sunshine here. Hold on, keep going.
Okay, all right. And I know that Bernard is well acquainted with this situation, so I'd like him to jump in after I share my thoughts on the situation. I don't think I ever told Jeremy Mitchell this or his family, but he fundamentally altered who I am as a politician. And when I say, if you want me to get real with you, this is what I mean. When I started out my journey in electoral politics, I thought that politicians had to look a certain way, had to sound a certain way, had to have the right friends, had to work with a certain group of consultants out of Des Moines, had to toe a party line, so on and so forth. And Jeremy Mitchell was an individual here who was the victim of a police interaction where he was shot and paralyzed while trying to flee an officer here in Cedar Rapids. And this happened shortly after I was reelected. In fact, I don't even believe I had taken office yet when this happened. And per usual, the only folks who were up in arms about this at the beginning was the African American community, and people were demanding answers. And at that time, I was the only person of color in elected office in Lynn County outside of Nancy Humbles, who continues to serve on the Cedar Rapids Community School Board. Bernard, you might want to check that fact, but I think we were the only two elected officials of color at that time. And so a lot of folks are asking me, hey, you ran on, a platform of being a voice for the people who have never really had a voice in politics. What are you going to do about it? And I was privy to a lot of information that the public wasn't privy to. And in my estimation, I will go to my grave believing this, that there was foul play on behalf of other elected officials and public officials, law enforcement agencies, in conspiring against this individual to paint him a certain way, to not provide him due process, and the entire process surrounding that case was fundamentally tainted, and it makes me sick to my stomach to think about it to this day. I believe there's still litigation going on. I believe that his family is suing the city of Cedar Rapids. But here is how it changed my life. I decided at that point, I was done. I was done playing the game of doing everything you have to do that is accepted by white society, by the political elite, because, you know, what would have been in vogue would have been for me to shut my mouth. We don't venture out on issues that are controversial. We don't challenge sitting county attorneys. We don't make a big fuss about race because it's not going to play well in a majority white state. And there are a few politicians that, quite honestly, I was modeling myself after, that I had looked up to, and I had grown so disappointment in their reticence when they would tell me in private that they knew this was wrong. They would tell me in private that it is so brave and courageous as to what you're doing, but they wouldn't dare speak up about this issue. And it just made me sick. It turned me off to a lot of leaders in the Democratic Party. And it made me sad that leading up to that point in my life, I was so careful with how I behaved because I was constantly seeking the approval of people who, quite honestly, were trading, the prospects of a political reward for doing what is right. And it changed who I was as a politician. And I decided at that point I was going to live with the consequences of doing what is right and speaking my mind and taking the hits if I was convicted about something. And I was convicted about this case. I will go to my grave believing that what happened to him was unfair. It was a travesty of justice. And his example was just another example of how structural racism, institutional racism, and to Bernard's earlier point, white supremacy, structural racism and institutional racism in this country are functions of white supremacy, but how those elements conspire together to visit catastrophic harm in some cases on people of color in this country.
Yeah.
Well, that case was an interesting case, and I would say Ferguson came north that November 1st, and essentially, I'm not going to try to litigate the case here, but there's certain facts that doesn't make any sense on the case. Now, this officer previously had shot a white gentleman before. And I got a chance to read the county attorney report on him, on this particular shooting. The guy he shot first initially did not have a chance. His pants literally fell down, and the man was shot with his pants down. And consistent with both incidents, and this incident, they was using an undercover car. It didn't have cameras on it. And in the case of Jeremy Mitchell, the car did have cameras on it, but the microphone, the audio portion of the film was not working because the batteries failed in. So that was a consistency. And Jeremy Mitchell's license plate lights being out, I reviewed that video. I have not, I just don't see it. And again, this was a situation where essentially it said to Jeremy Mitchell, because he's a black man and a criminal, he deserved what he deserved it. And as the county attorney described it, he described drug dealers as being dangerous. And that's another thing I think we need to talk about in this Black Lives Matter thing. White people are conditioned to believe that Black people are overly violent or animal-like, to just put it out there bluntly. And it's that fear of Black people that drives a lot of these police shootings. Now, in the case of Jeremy Mitchell, getting back to that, and this is a fact, not nothing made up. And but I will only say this: I don't know no more about it. Jeremy Mitchell and Officer Jones, his wife, both worked together as beauticians. Now, I do not know what their relationship was. But I do not know what their relationship was. But I do know this one fact, that their wives were co-workers. So I just put, there's probably more to this case than meets. It's probably more to this case than meets the eye. But again, the county attorney did some interesting things. He claimed that he couldn't get to Jeremy Mitchell because he was taken out of state. And I'm not a lawyer, but I looked up the state code. Jeremy Mitchell's wife and lawyer of record at the time could have been charged with obstructing the investigation, because in the state of Iowa, and I know as a lawyer on this call, you can correct me if I'm wrong, if an individual deliberately moves a witness where law enforcement cannot talk to them, that is against the law. So essentially, Jeremy Mitchell's, and I'm not saying they did break the law, but the allegation that the county attorney made is that Jeremy Mitchell's wife and attorney of record at that time both broke the law by taking Jeremy Mitchell out of the state to be out of the reach of the state of Iowa. So I'm gonna let it go back.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot. So in keeping with that, somebody asked, in kind of a similar vein here, what can be done to stop racial profiling among law enforcement here in Iowa and across the US? I know here in Des Moines, we've been working hard to get a racial profiling ordinance, passed here. And I don't know what's going on in other cities and other areas, and a lot of this, I've certainly heard of police departments doing better, trying to do better with educating officers about racial profiling and understanding minority communities better than maybe a lot of them do. And I know because I've sat on meetings with the Des Moines Human and Civil Rights Council, where some officers have been there, and lots of members of the Black community have been there as well to discuss these issues. And I've heard the police department say that they're actively always trying to hire more officers of color. At the same time, I know from my 20 years in the judicial system, though, that just hiring people of color, just that metric alone is not the answer. That's definitely not, the answer. It certainly can help. But what would you say to that, Stacy, about stopping racial profiling?
That's a great question. It's a big question, and I will preface my response with the fact that every community is different, and what makes communities unique should be taken into consideration with whatever approach you will try to implement. But generally speaking, what is helpful to prevent and lessen things like racial profiling? You can do in-person implicit bias training and do it regularly with your law enforcement agencies. What that does, generally speaking, is it helps people understand the science of how our brains work. And so we have an idea of how we are making decisions based off of, subjective, objective information that we receive, and understanding how we make decisions and sort of developing routines to help us make better decisions and more equitable decisions is something that we need routine training in. And it's not just law enforcement officers, but it's other folks who are part of the criminal legal system could use that. Another thing that is helpful is trying to keep officers who are starting off, that usually, due to seniority, and that they don't have a lot of it at the beginning of their careers. If I think there's a city in Illinois that does this, that allows officers at the beginning of their career to live in the neighborhoods that they police, so that their neighbors probably don't look like them, and they shop at the same grocery store as folks who don't look like them. And it's designed to help them acclimate and understand the humanity of folks that they may not have a whole lot of experience in dealing with. And that's certainly the case with a lot of law enforcement agencies here in Iowa. A lot of folks who come out of the academy are folks who grew up in towns where there weren't a whole lot of Black folks. So if you are living in neighborhoods where there are a whole lot of Black and brown people, you start, the idea is that you would see them a little differently. And then another thing I think we need to get to in this country is the philosophy of law enforcement. And this starts at the academy and it persists throughout agencies. Mm-hmm. But right now there's this warrior mindset that is ingrained in people, in our law enforcement officers. And if law enforcement officers were taught to think of themselves as not as warriors, but as sort of, the protectors of, or the peacekeepers of, or the servants of, and I know we throw those words around a lot, but there is something to be said about the philosophy of why the job exists. And I know that it exists for many different reasons, but there is this emphasis put on, we have to stop crime and we have to neutralize aggressors and this, that, and the other. But if it moved from a warrior mindset to a caretaker mindset, and we moved from there, I think that would generally be beneficial. And that takes a whole lot of work. Again, these are institutions that have, for generations, have been filled with mostly white guys with little experience with Black folks. And so changing these institutions takes a whole lot of work. And it's not something that happens overnight. It's why these liberation movements exist, to keep pressure on folks who have the power and the ability to make these decisions. And it's something that politicians, Black and white, need to talk about often.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, the whole criminal justice system and the prison system, which again is like a whole other show. But the prison system in this country, that's something that as an attorney, I because I have represented people that end up in prison, and I care about people wherever they are, including everybody who's living in prison. I've also looked at the way other countries do prison compared to the way the United States does prison. Mm-hmm. And in a lot of other nations, prison, don't get it twisted, it's not some luxury lifestyle, but the prisons look more like basic apartments as far as like their living quarters go. They're not, if it's a low rate, if these are super violent offenders, maybe that's a different story. But if I'm talking about for kind of regular non-violent offenders, they're in prison, but they are treated like
with
human
dignity.
beings, with dignity,
yeah.
and with the dignity that every human being should be treated with, not in the appalling and abhorrent conditions, some of which Brian Stevenson talks about in his book Just Mercy, if anybody hasn't read it, where we literally, like we mentioned, are imprisoning, putting people that go to prison in treating them absolutely not even like animals. We treat our pets, most of us treat our pets better than a lot of people in the United States of America are treated in prisons. And that should not be. And what do we expect about a recidivism rate when our prisons are places that dehumanize people instead of, you know, teaching them skills and what was that, Mr. Clayton?
Reforming them.
Right, reforming them, giving them skills, helping them gain education, and all of those. I mean, all of those other things. Yeah.
And I want to get in here. I got another book for you, Rise of the Warrior Cop. That would be a very good. That'd be a very good book for people to read. And we have to understand that policing started in slave patrols in this country. That's kind of the basic genesis. And they simply evolved. They evolved into policing. And an old man told me once, he was from down south, and he said that that basically that black people were considered to be garbage, and it was the job of the police to take care of them. So I'm thinking we can have implicit bias training, which I think is a good thing, but we have to change the overall thinking of the white populace. Is that we're not to be feared. And also, if something is done for the benefit, like a lot of times, if something seems to be beneficial for black folks, white people will immediately try to shut it down if they don't see, because we're not supposed to benefit from anything. You know, we're less than human, I guess, would be the terminology that I would use. So we have to look at how policing evolved in this country. And like I say, it evolved from the slave catchers and the slave patrols. Mm-hmm. So there's in one respect, there's no accident how the black people are treated by law enforcement.
Right. And again, it goes back to, you know, learning the history, and we're so woefully undereducated, you know, in this country that most, if not all, I never like to say the word all, but probably all public schools in this country don't really teach anything of any depth about the history of Black people in this country. And then no wonder that everything perpetuates, because people are growing up really totally ignorant of the reality of what has happened over the course of history in this country in regards to Black people. Couple of things, just comments and statistics. Scott Rowland, who is a volunteer on our campaign, just tossed a statistic here in the chat that African-American poverty in Iowa, 37.8% for children. So 37.8% of Black children in Iowa living in poverty, and 30.7% of all Black people in Iowa living in poverty. Then Shelley just made a comment that systemic racism and institutional racism in healthcare is leading to the disparities we're seeing in the COVID death rates in people of color. We've not tested adequately, and people of color have increased risk of underlying comorbidities or pre-existing conditions, I guess, or, you know, pre-existing health issues. We also have them in essential jobs. So people of color are more likely to be doing essential jobs, service jobs, factory jobs, serving as nurses' aides and those in nursing homes and those kinds of jobs, and high-risk exposures, which compound, and that's why we have infection rates increasing among people of color and the working poor, you know, of all colors, the working poor who are really on the front lines.
Yes, all of that is absolutely 100,000% true, and it has nothing to do. It's through no fault of their own, right? They were born Black, born into a country that has systematically and institutionally oppressed them, and in doing so has put them in the position where, you know, most people of color, Black and brown folks, I should say, are essential service workers, where they have to go to work, and they work in these in a lot of times confined spaces, so they are more exposed, if you will, to COVID-19, and even where they live and home ownership. A lot of Black and brown folks live in apartments and in close quarters, and they have multi generations living in one household in a lot of respects. So none of this is their fault. I got to be really, really clear about that. But this is the result of generations of systemic harm and institutional racism. So Shelley was absolutely right.
Mhm. Bailey had a couple of questions or comments and questions over here in the QA. She said to me, Kimberly, you've already spoken about listening to the voices of those impacted by racism and specifically anti-Black racism. Oftentimes it's frustrating to see the ways our white elected officials respond when questioned about the policies, statements, and actions they have made that have supported systemic racism. How have you responded, or how would you hope to respond in instances in which racism has manifested itself through you? Yeah, I mean, the first step in all of this is that and I only ever speak for me, to be clear, is that for me is getting to the place where when you hear you are racist, you don't immediately throw up a 10-foot thick wall in front of your face. And that's hard to do, because if you're like a good, I'm using air quotes, but we all know what I mean, I hope. Like if you're a good person and you consider yourself a good person and a good-hearted person that wants good for other people, to hear, well, what you just did was racist, or what you just said was racist, human beings get defensive. That's a thing human beings do. And it's very easy to immediately get defensive. And so part of the work that I've tried to do in the last few years, and believe me, I do not always succeed, and I'm far from perfect, is to, read books like White Fragility, which some people will never even read, by the way, because of the title. Who wants to be told, oh, you're fragile? I don't know very many people who want to be told that. And so it's getting over that hurdle first to say, oh, wait, I grew up in a country where in my public school education, I didn't even learn the accurate history, not even a snippet of it, of Black people in this country. So how can I possibly be anything but racist in regards to something that I just have no knowledge of, I don't have sufficient education on? And then it's about going out and as an adult, seeking that education so that you can be open to hearing what you did was racist, what you said was racist. And then the other thing is, lucky for me, I have people like Stacey Walker, who I am able to say, oh shit, I did this or said that, damn it, what, how can I do better? How do I do better? What should I have done? And you just have to be willing to listen. And I am not perfect at that. It's always a work in progress, and the old, when you know more better, you do better. And that's what I strive for. But at least if you start from that place, I think you have a chance. If you're one of those white people saying, I don't see color, well, then you're dead in the water. Because it's not about not seeing color. It's about seeing color and then listening. And being open to hearing about history and about current day, what's happening to people of color and why, and how that is systemic and institutionalized. So I hope that, that's another 10-hour conversation, Bailey. And feel free to email me, Kimberly@kimberlyforiowa.com, and we can talk more about it or have a phone call. And then Bailey also asks, what one or two things would you, Mr. Clayton and Stacey, like me, like Kimberly, as a white leader, to take away from this conversation? What is one thing you would like to see from leaders to support people of color? It's a great question. Thanks, Bailey. Both of them are great questions.
It's a good question. I would say you have to be willing to stand up for your position, because the one thing you have to look at, I'm not trying to justify it, people are products of their environment. There's no accident why certain politicians won't speak up on certain things, because they know how the populace thinks, and it's hard to go against it's hard to go against the populace, particularly when you know that there's something's right. It's always easy to be a expedient. So what individuals in a position, and then you got to spend your political capital appropriately, but you have to be willing to know when you need to risk your political capital and if something is correct to talk about at the time. You can't jump for every little thing. So I say you have to be brave to speak up to your community and at the same time be able to mesmerize your community and get them to like what you say. So I mean that's part. That's part. I'm gonna say statesmanship and womanship. I would say would be required of white politicians and politicians. Period. That they could be a politician, but hopefully they will evolve into being a stateswoman or a statesman.
You know, I really appreciate that question, and it is a hope of mine that one day this Democratic Party in the state of Iowa will have more people who are willing to educate themselves on these issues and take what they are learning from, you know, a lot of the books that Bernard suggested and a lot of the experts and activists in a variety of communities, take that outside of those spaces where those conversations happen and have those conversations in dialogue with the larger population here in Iowa. But our politicians, our Democrats, are so risk averse that they don't even do that. You know, we don't have these conversations. And that's why it's seen as bold, you know, every 4 years when a presidential candidate will brush up against one of these issues. But this is real life stuff. This is my reality, you know, and this is the reality of so many people in this state and around this country who look like me. And I want it to become commonplace and not this sort of thing we think we have to add into the platform to throw a bone to the progressives, but for folks to realize that, you know, elections matter and the policies that our elected politicians advocate for matter. And you just asked Jeremy Mitchell, right? Like these are real life situations that African Americans can find themselves in. So I guess my advice is to be encouraged, to stay encouraged, and have courage when it comes to continuing to talk about these issues with conviction, and to talk about them not with the goal to pander, but to help other folks understand why they're important, and to push this party to be much better than it has been on these issues, and to get people who are currently elected in federal office and statewide office to acknowledge that these issues, one, exist, acknowledge that the status quo is insufficient, and acknowledge and advocate for policies that are bold enough to actually course correct.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Jasmine has a question here. She says, and then I think this is the last question, at least that I see right now. After this question, I think we'll just take one more because I don't see any behind it right now, and then we'll wrap up. Jasmine says she apologizes. She was a little tied up, so I guess she came in late. She said she wanted to somehow address, and I think we did talk about this, Jasmine, but we can talk about it for a little bit as well now, that predominantly Black communities don't have access to healthcare or simply to the education about COVID-19 that they need, and how can we help the citizens of Iowa, especially those communities of color who need help, and I'm guessing she means particularly in, I think you maybe mean, Jasmine, correct me if I'm wrong, in relation to the COVID-19 pandemic.
So I'll take a stab at
Supervisor Walker is at the forefront of this right now, like at a hot spot in Lynn County. So he's probably been literally dealing with all day, every day for some time now.
Yeah. So like with any big issue where you're trying to communicate to as many people as possible, the communication piece and the education piece really varies from demographic to demographic. as I sought advice from folks who work with the refugee community and the immigrant community, we talked about trying to get information that can be shared on WhatsApp, because a lot of individuals in that community have that app. We talked about making sure we were communicating with the grocery stores, the markets that a majority of these individuals shop at, making sure that those folks are aware so they can transmit information. You know, in the African American community, when we are looking for innovative ways to communicate information, we oftentimes rally the faith community so that faith leaders have the same information. We go to barbershops and hair salons. I'm speaking in general here. I know we're not going to barbershops and hair salons in the middle of this pandemic. So that again is communication and education is going to be different and look different depending on which demographic you're trying to reach. But, you know, the other issue is, when we talked a lot about this, is, you know, African Americans, people of color, are at a higher risk of contracting the virus because they often have comorbidities that is rooted in structural and institutional racism. But also, as Shelley pointed out in her comment, these folks tend to work the jobs that we have deemed essential, and they are. But, you know, some employers are treating as if they are expendable. And so not only are they already at higher risk because of comorbidities due to institutional and structural racism, but they're going into jobs where a lot of times they're working in close quarters with other people because they don't have paid leave and because the job needs to get done. And they worry about what happens if they assert themselves and demand paid leave and things of that nature. And it is no secret that a product of capitalism is that profit is always placed above the interest of people. And it's my hope that folks like Kimberly Graham win their elections and go to Congress and go to the U.S. Senate and can start to change some of these things.
Yeah, one of the things I say most in my conversations with people is that this campaign is about placing people over profits. I mean, it really, you can boil it down to that. I'm sorry, Mr. Clayton, I cut you off. What were you saying?
What I was going to say, another piece of it is that we have to have an ongoing conversation with different communities. We just can't wait till a crisis. I mean, it's easy to talk with people when you have an ongoing relationship with them than when you come up during a crisis. So, so that's one thing that I really believe needs to happen. And I think the things that the supervisor talked about, the treatment that different people are receiving on their jobs in terms of pay and other conditions. After this crisis is over with, I hope we don't forget them, that we will visit these things and try to correct these things, because there's the things that need to be corrected.
Right. And, you know, and I would say, just from a kind of, you know, related issue, if these jobs are so essential, then they sure as heck better be paid better. So I hope maybe we can, this is a good little moment in history to step in and really start advocating for that, you know, more than ever, because if they're essential, then we better pay them a lot better. The last question is from Sam. She says she lives in a very rural part of Iowa where she mostly sees white people, though there are obviously some people of color. She asks, what are the type of issues my local campaign could help with for rural people of color? Sam is running. Is Sam running for office? Somebody type at me. I think Sam may be running. Okay, we're not sure. I think so, but and I'm sorry, Sam, if I'm forgetting, and like I'm trying to keep 50 plates spinning in the air in the last couple of weeks.
Well,
Anyway, so what are the types of issues that her local campaign, I think she might be running for like state House of Representatives. I'm not 100% sure on that, but anyway, can help with people For State House, yes, she's running for State House.
Well, I got one
For rural-
suggestion for Sam.
What's that?
I have one suggestion for Sam that she could do is make public education a right in the state of Iowa. That'd be well funded, and eventually it should be enshrined. It should be in the state constitution that all children in the state of Iowa are entitled to a well-funded quality education, and that should be a right. That's something that will help everybody across. But that would be something that would help everybody across the board. But that would be my one suggestion that she could do.
Awesome. And oh, yes, she is. State House, House District 12. So Sam Muhr, M-U-H-R, everybody. So Sam is here and running for State House, House District 12. We got to take back
Sam,
the
thank you.
legislature so we can get some stuff done here and then take the governor's mansion back.
We got a lot of work to do.
We do have a lot of work to do, but you know, I think we're going to see some major positive changes in the 2020 elections and going forward from there. I think what I see, Mr. Clayton and Stacy, is that I see more and more what I call shorthanded regular people. I see more regular people stepping up and running for office like me. I'm just a dum-dum who, you know, comes from, I'm a first generation college student. I got lucky, you know, I went to good public schools and I had some dumb luck and I went to college and then I made my way to law school and worked my way through there. And I'm lucky to represent kids and families in juvenile court. And, you know, I'm a single mom. I've been a single mom since my son was 7 and I got massive student loans like a lot of people in this country because you're looking at who paid for law school and college. And, you know, and I just decided if I don't step up, who else is going to be the progressive person who's willing to, I don't know, some would probably say have the audacity to do something like a Black Lives Matter forum, which I frankly think is kind of that's a floor. Like I just see this as, well, of course we need to talk about these issues. Of course we need to, not like, oh, should we, shouldn't we? That's not even a question. And it shouldn't be a question for anybody who's running for office, in my opinion. So, you know, I believe that we people of all religions, all races, all cultures, all economic backgrounds need to be running for Congress, need to be running for federal office. Because if we regular people of all economic backgrounds don't run for office, then all we have is not entirely, but a lot, the majority of people in Congress are wealthy or well-connected to wealth. And then we've got all that corporate money influence. And so we get what we get. So until we get a critical mass of regular people in there who aren't going to vote for these tax giveaways to Amazon and Walmart and Exxon, and who are going to instead say, no, we need to be investing in people. We need to be making investments in people and not investments in corporations, because that trickle down stuff ain't trickling down to nobody. Yeah.
Amen. We you know, you hit on something. The problem with our politics, and this includes the Democratic Party, is that, you know, the party leaders who are there, the party elite, they meddle in primaries and they pick people who they know that they want to back, who they know are going to vote exactly like them. You end up without, first off, that's unfair. And then you end up without any ideological diversity. And if everybody is going to Washington to vote the exact way that a party leader expects them to vote, it's very, very hard for these progressive ideas to even break into the mainstream. And these progressive ideas often represent the voices of people who are forgotten, the powerless, the folks on the outside, the folks on the fringes. And so this is a power system that perpetuates itself and looks out for itself. And so that is why it is more important to have politicians like you, Kimberly, who speak your mind, who is rooted in grassroots organizing, that is firmly rooted with the people, to try to chip away at that a little bit. And I think you're following in the footsteps of some wonderful people who in the last few years have come to office, like Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and others who had the audacity to challenge a system, to challenge a democratic establishment. And you are pushing them to really address the needs of working people and address the needs of minority communities and address the needs of people who don't have a voice. So I applaud you and I appreciate you, and I hope you stay encouraged. And you know that I will do everything I can to ensure a primary victory and a win in the general election.
Thanks, JC. I appreciate it. Mr. Clayton, you want any closing remarks?
Well, first of all, I'd like to say, well, thank you. Race, I always say this, and I kind of get people's ears burning when I say that. And I say this to Supervisor Walker. But remember one thing, Supervisor: racism is bipartisan. Just remember, but just remember that racism is bipartisan. And my closing remark, as far as Black Lives Matter, I think ultimately, in the short term, what should be done, either on the federal level or the state level, there should be a bureau of inspection created to investigate incidents that the police do that if civilians did them, they would be felonies. And it would take it directly, and that could be structured in a number of ways. I had one thing on the state level is to have the Attorney General office and some people from law enforcement and some civilians to round out the thing. But they would have enforcement power. They would be able to investigate and go beyond what a county attorney would do. And go beyond what a county attorney do. And I also think when police officers do things, and I don't want to deprive them of their constitutional rights, but they work for the public. Certain things that, like when a police officer shoots somebody, that should never go into a grand jury. That should be something that should be heard squarely in public. And I guess the laws would have to be changed to also guarantee the constitutional right of law enforcement. So I don't want anyone's constitutional rights taken away. But that was kind of how I see things. What needs to happen?
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Clayton. Khadijah, who is our field director and his moderating comments or looking at comments and feeding them to me from the Facebook live feed, just posted. She just wanted people to know that my field director, Khadijah, is a Muslim woman of color, and that our campaign manager is a trans woman, and that this is a people-powered movement looking out for vulnerable communities. And absolutely. So, that's.
You've got a great staff, Kimberly, by the way.
We do. And we also, my senior strategist in social media, a digital outreach guru who's responsible for our Twitter following going from 0 last June to 47,000 followers today, is Tim Nelson. And he is a person with disabilities. And he, of course, works from home. And he's phenomenal. So yeah, we've got a really diverse in various ways campaign staff. It's lean, it's small campaign staff. People's minds are kind of blown when they find out how few people we have running a U.S. Senate campaign. But so far it worked. I don't know if you guys know or saw. I don't know if you saw, Stacy, or if I told you, but we won the Des Moines Register MediaCom poll about a month ago. Out of the 5 Democrats running for U.S. Senate, we had the most name recognition and the highest favorability ratings. And I owe
oh
that.
My God.
I know. I was shocked pleasantly. And on the least budget, on the lowest budget of all the U.S. Senate campaigns. And I owe that to Tim Nelson, our digital outreach, and I owe that to 40,000 miles on my car between May of 2019 and March of 2020. I've gone everywhere and listened to everyone, and I'm going to keep doing it. It's going to do it video now, but we're just going to keep doing that through the June 2nd primary. So everybody, thank you, Supervisor Walker, and thank you, Mr. Clayton. And we so appreciate you taking the time to talk to us. And we'll have those books and movies and all those good resources here in the chat that people can look at later. And tomorrow at, I think it's 3 p.m., we're going to be having another one of these forums that's going to be called Ask Kimberly Anything. And it is, anyone can join. And it's specifically aimed toward our Latinx viewers and Spanish speakers, because we're going to have a translator, a Spanish translator during that forum tomorrow afternoon. So that'll be exciting. So tune in for that. And thank you, everybody. And we'll see you again
Thank you.
soon. Thank you, Mr.
Thank
Cruz.
you.
Thanks, Stacy. Bye, everybody.
And God bless.
Bye.
Thank you. You too.